I would like to review with you the solutions for the Test Your Knowledge pre-check for circles. The first skill was to simplify square root expressions. Again, we've done this before, but it does come up with the equations of circles. So the square root of 12, we look for a perfect square factor, which is 4. We rewrite that as the square root of 4 times 3, which simplifies to be this 2 on the square root of 3. The square root of 27, a perfect square factor of 27 is 9. We write that as 9 times 3. The square root of 9 is 3, and then root 3. The square root of 54 can be rewritten as the square root of 9 times 6. And the square root of 9 is 3, square root of 6. 48, if you look at all the factors of 48, 1 in 48, 2 in 24, 3 in 16, 4 and 12, and 6 and 8. The only one that is a perfect square is 16, so we write this as 16 times 3. And the square root of 16 is 4 on the square root of 3. (108) is 36 times 3. And the square root of 36 is 6 on the square root of 3. 3 on the square root of 18, we can rewrite 18 as the square root of 9 times 2. So we have 3 times the square root of 9, which is 3 times the square root of 2, or 9 on the square root of 2. The second skill is to identify values from a formula. So each of these equations are in the form the quantity x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared, and we need to find the values of h, k, and r. Number 7, we have x squared plus y squared equals 16. Well, to write this as some binomial squared, this is equivalent to just x minus 0 squared plus y minus 0 squared, and 16 we can write as 4 squared. So h is 0, k is 0, and r is 4. Number 8 is x minus 2 quantity squared plus y minus 1 quantity squared equals 25. This is basically in this form. So we have x minus h, that is, h is 2. Y minus k, k is 1. And 25 is r squared, so r is the square root of 25, or just 5. Number 9 is x plus 9 squared plus y minus 7 squared equals 4. Well, x plus 9 is the same thing as x minus negative 9 quantity squared plus y minus 7 quantity squared, and 4 if we want to go ahead and write that as 2 squared. So in this case, h is negative 9, k is 7, and r is 2. So I'm just identifying what number is subtracted from the x variable, the y variable, and then what's the value that we squared to get the number on the right. Number 10 is x squared plus y minus 1 squared equals 28. Well, there is no number subtracted from x, so we can say that's x minus 0 squared plus y minus 1 squared equals 28. We'll deal with that in just a minute. So h is 0, k is 1, and r squared is 28. So to find r, we find the square root of 28. but 28 is 4 times 7, so r is simply 2 on the square root of 7. The next skill was to find the distance between 2 points. The distance formula is defined by d equals the square root of x1 minus x2 quantity squared plus y1 minus y2 quantity squared. I suggest you label the points. So in number 11 we have negative 4, 2 and 4, 10. So if we label those as x1, y1 and x2, y2, and again it doesn't matter which order you put the 1s and the 2s, but the x and y is important. So here we have distance would be equal to the square root of negative 4 minus 4 squared plus 2 minus 10 squared. So our distance is simplified to be negative 8 squared plus a negative 8 squared. So all that's in the radical. This simplifies to be the square root of 64 plus 64 when we square those values. Now understand the square root of 64 times, or plus 64 is really 2 times 64. So this really would be, I mean it's 128, but if we think of that as the square root of 64 times 2, it will simplify to be 8 on the square root of 2. The distance between the ordered pairs 2, 1 and negative 3, 5 would be d is equal to the square root of, in parentheses, 2 minus negative 3 quantity squared plus 1 minus 5 quantity squared. So the distance is the square root of 2 minus negative 3 is 5 squared plus 1 minus 5 is negative 4 squared. Simplifying inside the square root gives us the square root of 25 plus negative 4 squared is 16. When we add those together, we get the square root of 41. Number 13 is to find the distance between 5, negative 1 and negative 3, 2. So the distance is the square root of 5 minus negative 3 quantity squared plus negative 1 minus 2 quantity squared. Distance would be equal to the square root of 5 plus 3, or 8 squared, and I'll go ahead and write that as 64. Negative 1 minus 2 is negative 3, and negative 3 squared is positive 9. So simplifying that gives us that distance is the square root of 73. And number 14 is to find the distance between 6, 8 and 0, 2. So the distance is the square root of, parentheses, 6 minus 0 squared plus, in parentheses, 8 minus 2 squared. We get distance is the square root of 6 squared, or 36, plus 8 minus 2 is 6. 6 squared, 36. Now that is, the square root is 72. But in the previous explanation, like in number 11, I was showing you that really 36 plus 36 is 36 times 2. So that simplifies to be 6 on the square root of 2. Another skill in this section was to find the midpoint of a line segment. So midpoint, if you recall, is really the average of the x and the average of the y's. So it's x1 plus x2 divided by 2 and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So to find the midpoint between 8, 4, and 10, negative 4, we would say 8 plus 10 divided by 2 and negative 4 plus negative 4 divided by 2, which that simplifies to be 18 divided by 2, or 9. Negative, no, I'm sorry, I wrote that wrong, didn't I? 4 plus negative 4 is 0 divided by 2, which is just 0. Negative 4, 2, and 4, 10. We have negative 4 plus 4 divided by 2, and 2 plus 10 divided by 2. Simplifying gives us 0 divided by 2, or 0. 2 plus 10 is 12 divided by 2, or 6. Number 17, the midpoint between 2, 1 and negative 3, 5. We again add our x values, so 2 plus negative 3, and divide that by 2. Add the y values, 1 plus 5, and divide by 2. Simplifying gives us 2 plus negative 3 is negative 1 divided by 2 is just negative 1/2. 1 plus 5 is 6 divided by 2, or 3. The midpoint between 5, negative 1 and negative 3, 2. Again, we add our x, so 5 plus negative 3 divided by 2, and negative 1 plus 2 divided by 2. So that would become 5 plus negative 3 is 2 divided by 2, or 1. And negative 1 plus 2 is 1 divided by 2, or 1/2. And lastly is to complete the square. So we need to find the value of n that makes each polynomial a perfect square trinomial, and then factor the expression. Recall that to make a perfect square trinomial, the value of n has to be half of the middle coefficient squared. So n in number 19, when we have x squared plus 18x plus n has to be half of 18 squared. So that's 9 squared, or 81. And then if we had to factor x squared plus 18x plus 81, notice that that factors as x plus 9 times x plus 9, or x plus 9 squared. And again, that follows because the factors of 81, whose sum is 18, are 9 and 9. Y squared minus 10y plus n, well, n has to be half of the negative 10 squared. So half of negative 5 squared is 25. Then if we factor y squared minus 10y plus 25, notice that that factors as y minus 5 times y minus 5, or y minus 5 squared. X squared minus 3x plus n, well, n has to be half of negative 3, so negative 3 divided by 2, squared, which is positive 9/4. When we factor that, that's a little bit trickier because of the fraction, but x squared minus 3x plus 9/4 would factor as x minus 3/2 times x minus 3/2. In fact, it's always the number that you square. After you take half of and square, that's the number that goes inside the binomial. So x minus 3/2 squared. And then y squared plus y plus n. N is half the coefficient of y, so the coefficient of y is 1. Half of that is 1/2. Squared is 1/4. So to factor y squared plus y plus n, which is now 1/4, we would have y plus the number we just squared, which was 1/2, times y plus 1/2, or y plus 1/2 squared.